Welcome to the Daily Dawg podcast. Today is Thursday, September 25th, and this is week 5 of the 2025 college football season. For Georgia fans, this is Beat Bama week. We are focusing on all of our efforts and good psychic energy for our guys to get ready to go out there and beat Alabama. And while we have bowed to almost nobody in college football as Georgia fans, and certainly with back-to-back national championships in the 2021 and 2022 season, we can lay claim to as much dominance as anybody in the sport. We're not the defending national champions right now, but there's still no other team that has back-to-back national championships since Alabama several years back before that. So, but what have we had going against us, or what's the one thing we haven't been able to climb over the hill? We have just one win against Alabama in our last 10 meetings, and that includes a number of SEC championships and college football national championship game appearances. Well, really just 2. We met them twice in the college football national championship, and in that, we've at least split the games, which, you know, you'd think between 2 top teams, that's reasonable. I win 1, you win 1. We split those, but in 4 SEC championships, we've lost all 4 of those in those last 10 years, and that has cost us. We've talked about how Alabama has probably taken more from us than any of our rivals. Although as we go through this season and we get to play some of those other big rivals like Florida and Auburn coming up, we'll look at those histories and we'll talk about how some of the historic games cost us championship opportunities. But Alabama, certainly in recent years and maybe in all time, despite the fact that they're not really one of our top rivals, or certainly currently Georgia fans and the national perception is there's a huge rivalry between Georgia and Alabama because the 2 of us have been sitting at the top of the conference for the last 10 plus years. Kirby Smart, Nick Saban, Georgia, Alabama, sharing number 1, number 2, basically back and forth in the conference. And that's definitely the case. But from our perspective, as much success as we've had, that one thing that's sort of elusive is the consistent ability to beat Alabama. I don't think we would have expected to go on a 9 out of 10 run against a team as good as Alabama, especially when coached by Nick Saban. But at this point, the way these 2 teams meet as equals, talent-wise, capability, overall success, national perception, national accomplishments, SEC champions, you name it, there should be more balance. There should be more parity, and this is a chance for us to start building a little more of that parity. It is true, however, that if we can win this game, having won the 2021 national championship game, this will be, so we're on a 2-game losing streak currently. We've lost 9 of 10, but what I guess I'm trying to get at is we're on a 2-game losing streak currently. So if we could win this game, then all of a sudden in the last 4 games at least, we'll be 2-2, and that's starting to build towards the kind of balance you would think would exist in a series between these kind of teams. So, all right. So what have we done? We've already looked at that history. We've talked about that. That kind of summarizes where we've come so far in the podcast this week. So what are we going to talk about today? First thing I want to do, first segment, we're going to jump in and we're going to talk a little bit about historical perspective again, just for a minute. I know I covered a lot of history, but I was thinking about a number of things that I've brought up all throughout the season so far in podcast, and namely how there are no juggernaut teams. And you hear me keep saying over and over again, look, we don't have to beat or be better than 2021 Georgia or 2022 Georgia. We only have to be good enough relative to the teams that are out there now to make the playoff and win a playoff series. So have a little perspective on that. And I've kind of clued you into my life as a college football fan, sports fan. Obviously, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, but really started understanding sports and the data and the numbers, and more than just watching the games and being excited. You know, the 80s is where it really took off for me. So I tend to look at everything from 1980. And obviously, as Georgia fans, we don't mind if the world starts at 1980. That's a good place to start for us. But I was just thinking back to college football of the 80s and 90s and where we are right now, and I'm going to offer a little perspective on that. That'll be our first segment. And then the second segment, we're just going to jump into the more of the breakdowns like we did for Tennessee. We already started yesterday by going over in detail the Alabama FSU game, because We had already talked about DeBoer and who he is a day before that, and there's no real big matchup. There's just the one game between DeBoer and Kirby Smart, the Alabama game last year. I'm not sure if that's that informative. It gives us the same kind of detail and breakdown efforts that we would put like we did with Tennessee, where you had 4 games between Kirby Smart and Josh Heupel. So, but we've looked at DeBoer. We've talked about who he is. We've talked a little about who Alabama was last season, what their record's been and what they've done last season, what they've done so far this season. And maybe the most instructive game to give us a guidance, something that we can use as a data point to break down, is probably that FSU game, because that's the only game that Alabama has played so far where we see them really exerting themselves against some competition that we think is valuable. Wisconsin, we've talked about, just isn't the team that they've been in the past, and so they're probably really not much better of a test than Austin Peay was for us, or Marshall or Louisiana Monroe was for Alabama, the teams that are on their schedule. We've obviously also only played one significant team in that category too, Tennessee, so that gives only one data point. But there's a lot more consistency. What Georgia is over the last 5, 6, 10 years under Kirby Smart is pretty much the same. So the question is, and that does lead to those comparisons about, well, what is Georgia compared to Georgia? You know, Kirby Smart has been a team that has been able to impose its will. A lot of people thought in the early days that Georgia was all about man ball, as they called it, lining up and just kicking your butt on defense and running the ball down your throat. But Kirby's always said that he wants his offenses and his teams to be what he calls multiple. And that would be the ability to do a lot of different things, not just run the ball when you have to, throw the ball when you have to, keep moving the chains, have good possessions where you score, as many or most of your possessions as you can. You're efficient with the ball, but you also play complementary football. All these things we've talked about, complementary football, holding onto the ball enough to give your defense an opportunity to scheme and get ready for the next possession, and then you get out there. So in a perfect world, the team grabs the ball, moves down the field, not super slowly, but enough so that the defense can get itself together and be ready for the next possession and anticipate what the game conditions are going to be, because they can expect the offense to score on at least maybe half of those drives. So, that's and multiple means that, we're going to run the ball, we're going to throw the ball. And we've seen that. Last 2 years with Carson Beck as quarterback, we became ever more dependent on throwing the ball. And that's not just because of Carson Beck, but that was because we also didn't seem to have that stable of running backs, and for whatever reason, our offensive line, though it should have been last year and year before, and year before that, honestly, should have been among the 5 best offensive lines in the country. Last year, we saw some cracks in that. Carson was not sacked a ton, but there didn't seem to be a ton of holes, and the run game just seemed like there was a lot of plays were stymied. And we've already talked about that a lot this season so far, about and what Georgia needs to do this year, what we're looking for us to do, because last year we fell all the way to the point where we were being outgained in games, and we had allowed more yards rushing than we were averaging, which is sort of unheard of in the Kirby Smart era. So that man ball concept definitely gone. But we're trying to get back not to necessarily being man ball, but being truly multiple. So point of all that is to say we have a pretty good idea of what Georgia is and what Georgia wants to be. We know where we fell down the last year or two. We know where we're trying to get back to this year. And we've already seen signs that this team is emphasizing running the ball, and they're doing a little bit better job running the ball. They're emphasizing stopping the run, and they're doing a little bit better job stopping the run so far. So these are good trends. So we can apply that as we start to break down the game, the different aspects of what can happen in the game and the way we like to break it down and look at it: offense versus defense, defense versus offense, special teams, look at the true outcomes that are available, and then decide which of these outcomes are likely. And we're building towards that as we work our way towards predicting what we think is going to happen in the game this year with Alabama and Georgia. So that's really going to be our second segment. Is we're going to take a little dive into the history of college football for a minute, and then we're going to come back and we're going to start digging a little deeper. We've already spent a lot of time yesterday on breaking down that FSU game as our key data point of all of what's available with just the limited data to work with of Alabama under Kalen DeBoer. And it's most relevant because it's this year's team and how they've played against another Power 5 conference team that has looks like they could be a winning team. We don't know for sure what FSU is yet, but we know pretty much what Wisconsin is. Louisiana Monroe doesn't count. So we have a pretty good idea what we think Tennessee is. So that gives us a barometer of what Georgia is. So we're still very small data points and more guesswork than not involved in this. So, but we're going to break that down. So let me dive into what I think was this history idea I want to talk about. And I guess what it was, my thinking was I kept pondering how over and over again, I've brought you this idea of saying, look, we're going to look at the other teams that are competitors. We're going to look at what we do each week. We're going to look at the other 10 or 15 teams that are looking like the teams that are going to be part of the playoff or could be part of the playoff. Because again, I'm not so focused or worried about which group of 5 team emerges. Right now, it looks like Memphis, but I'm not deeply concerned about comparing us to Memphis. I don't care even if we end up playing Memphis in a first round game. We'll break all that down when we get there. But in the meantime, I don't think that the key matchup of how, who's going to win the national championship this year has anything to do with who Memphis plays in the first round and what the matchups between that are. What I think there's a handful of teams out there that we legitimately think are moving towards and trying to build a resume to get towards the playoff. And even with a 12-team field, I think it's important to recognize one of the things I don't love about the 12-team field is with a 12-team field, we've probably got several teams in there that are not really playoff, well, not playoff worthy. I guess they're playoff worthy under the rules that we've established for this idea of now what the playoffs are. But I don't think what they are is they're not likely to be teams, okay? It's like taking a look at last year's playoff. In your first round games, you had Indiana and Notre Dame. And I mentioned multiple times, Indiana got there. They were 11-1. They got beat by Ohio State. They didn't get embarrassed by Ohio State, but the one loss in the regular season was Ohio State. Ohio State was also the only decent team they played. And so they lost to the only good team they played, the only ranked team they played. Then they get into the playoff, and they played against Notre Dame. The final score on that was 27-17. It doesn't look embarrassing on paper, but I remember seeing some of that game and watching some of that game, and Indiana was not overly competitive. Notre Dame controlled that game throughout the game, even though it was only a 10-point game. So same thing, SMU. SMU, exceeded expectations in the ACC, made the playoff, got a first-round game against Penn State. They were on the road at Happy Valley. That game was never in doubt. They looked completely overmatched. They didn't look anything like the exciting team that everybody was excited about during the season. Okay, so Clemson, we know what Clemson was last year, and of course there's a lot of discussion about Clemson this year, but we beat Clemson 34-3, or I think, to start the season last year. Then Clemson got hot and looked a lot better as they went on throughout the season, and they got into the playoff. But they also backdoored their way into the playoff because of what other teams did. So they got in it, but they were competitive. They went on the road against Texas, and they didn't play bad, but they lost by 2 scores, and they were out. And then Tennessee, we thought, because of the way Ohio State played down the stretch, and we thought a demoralized Ohio State that was really down coming into the end of the season, and that's really hard to remember right now. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in just a minute as we get to it. But at this point, I'm just sort of recapping last year's playoff to kind of remind us, okay, here's what a 12-team field looks like. We've only seen it one time, but this is what it looks like. So you get these teams in here. These are your first-round games I'm going through. So Tennessee, I think as an SEC fan and homer, I was kind of looking forward to Tennessee, like a lot of people, going up to the Horseshoe up there in Ohio. And obviously a lot of Tennessee fans did. A bunch of them went up there and bought up tickets, and they were able to get tickets because I guess they were willing to spend whatever it takes. But Ohio State fans didn't necessarily start that excited. Kirk Herbstreit famously even suggested that this game might have been better for Ohio State had they been on the road, because there were going to be such bad vibes and energy in Columbus, Ohio, that maybe they wish they weren't at home in front of their home fans. And Tennessee brought a lot of people, but didn't matter. Ohio State just came out and dominated that game start to finish. Tennessee was never competitive. So here I was doing the opposite of what I expect. I put a lot of faith and hope that Tennessee offense, that I think can be a little gimmicky, but I thought they actually might come out with their run game and their defense that they featured last year, and I thought they might really play tough and physical and give Ohio State a battle, maybe win that game on the road, and we'd all get another chance to chant SEC, SEC, and just keep shouting it means more. Didn't happen. Tennessee got embarrassed. So, so Tennessee ends up being another one of those teams, had a nice record last year, made it to the playoff. But in reality, I think we have to look at that and say, look, they made it to the playoff, but they were, again, probably a charity team, right? As far as a playoff team. I mean, their record would not have gotten them into the 4-team playoff or all that close to it. Their record, if you go back all to the old bowl season, would have gotten them a nice bowl game. Maybe they would have played in the Citrus Bowl again. And everybody could be reminded about how you can't spell citrus without UT, right? But that's where they would have been. That's where this team would have been in the history of college football. And that's what I was thinking about a little bit this last day or two. How does this era, because we spend so much time saying in the portal era, in the NIL era, today this isn't, and I've been doing it too. I've been telling you, look, there are no juggernauts out there. And in this era of college football, we're not going to see this, we're not going to see that. Well, I felt like I need to take a moment and say, well, what did we used to see? What was this era? I mean, a lot of you lived through it. A lot of you remember it. I remember it, but I think I took some notes and looked back at the things that I remember, and I filled back in some of the details to jog my memory. And it gave me some perspective, and it just reminded me of what college football was. So even as I'm looking at this game between Tennessee and Ohio State, that was a playoff game last year. So we'll jump into, well, what was this era? The contrast was, basically what you had, and I've even referenced this. I talked about the playoff era, the BCS era. So going back, let's say from 1980, because as I've said, for all real good Bulldog fans in modern times, there's the older group that remembers the glory days of the 40s, and I'm happy to claim the glory days of the 40s, the glories from the 60s, 50s. 50s was not a great decade actually for Georgia football. But the 40s certainly was. 40s was an epic era for Georgia football. And I don't remember it. Wasn't there. Not that old. I don't know very many people who did. I don't know a lot of fans. I've talked to some when I was younger, but I haven't seen many recently who could tell me a lot of personal experience from those 40s years. And obviously the number of people who are left with us who would are getting pretty small. But anyway, so for many of us, the history of Georgia football and the measuring stick of where's Georgia football been has been that, and also just the modern era of football. I mean, when we look at it, each decade you go back, football, and again, it's changing so much right now that they don't relate. And that's part of what we're going to do right here in this little segment is we're going to say, well, what is football and how does it relate? So I guess what I'm saying is I'm looking at the last 45 years. I take 1980, so the whole decade of the 80s, the whole decade of the 90s, the 2000s, the early 2000s, the single digits, the 2010s, and then now we're in the 2020s. So, and we're halfway through that. We're in the 2025 season, but we've had 5 complete seasons. We've had the 2020 season, the 21, 22, 23, 24. So we've had 5 complete seasons of the 2020s so far. So we have 45 seasons of football that I've reflected on. And so what did you have back then? Well, back in the 80s and 90s, what you had was the basically the bowl era or the poll era, the way we pick national champions. And I know you probably know this, but just let's reflect on it a minute and think about it and compare it to where we are today. Conferences, you had a lot of conferences. There was several conferences. I mean, I don't know, back then, and I keep referencing, we used to call it Division I and Division II. So there's Division I football and Division II. Then they came up with FCS and FBS. And FCS meant, confusingly, Football Championship Series, because Division II schools would play an actual playoff sponsored by the NCAA, and I've mentioned this before. Whereas in FBS, or Football Bowl Subdivision, as they called it, the teams that were eligible to go to bowl games, they went to bowl games, and then the national champion was just picked. And we've talked about how there's a bunch of different entities that pick national champions. But for most of us college football fans, we're looking at, or especially if you're a Georgia fan, if you're a UCF fan, I guess you'll take any entity that's willing to pick you. If Nickelodeon publishes a magazine or a list for kids of who the college football champion is, then I think UCF is willing to stick that on the side of their stadium and say national champion. So sorry, picking at UCF and their whole thing from 2019, right? But anyway, but most of us look at the credible long-time national champion selectors out there, and those have been the coaches poll and the AP poll have been the big ones for like since the 1930s through the 80s and 90s, and they're still out there. There's still a coaches poll. We talked about its relevance. It's not very relevant. Basically, the only time anybody pays attention to the coaches poll is in the preseason because it comes out before the AP poll. Once the AP poll comes out, that's all anybody pays attention to till we get to the college football playoff poll. Once that comes out, that's all anybody pays attention to. That's the era we're in now. But it used to be that those polls meant everything, especially who was declared national champion. So there's the Football Writers Association that bestows a trophy, and I've mentioned that before, and you get to see that if you're part of the celebration for Georgia's national championships and the AP. And then, so there's different entities that put together and declare national champions. So you used to see, if you go back into the list of champions in the 1980s, 1990s, you'd see all these initials like somebody's credentials listed on a business card or something. So because all these different entities would select who the national champion is. So you go back to the Georgia National Championship of 1980, and one of the things as the undefeated team that we were, and maybe the only undefeated, I don't remember, I don't think any other teams finished that season undefeated, or at least not Division I teams or FBS teams, but we were it's not just about being undefeated, because again, there's not a straight league. So just winning out, being undefeated isn't it. Somebody has to vote you number one. So anyway, the concept that we've talked about, I've mentioned this before and you know it probably, but the concept then was consensus national champion, right? You had the coaches poll, you had the AP poll, you had the Football Writers Association, and 5 or 6 other entities that were well known and established that all came together and said, that's our national champion. And in the 45 years from 1980 through last year's complete season, there's actually, I counted up, there's actually been 49 champions, because we've had 4 seasons in which there were split national champions, or a significant entity that we respect picked a different champion than the other entity. So for instance, the coaches poll picked one team and the AP poll picked another, a la, as many people around here remember and know, the 1990 national championship, in which Colorado was the AP national champion and Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets were the UPI, or coaches. I think it was still called the UPI then, but United Press International, because you used to, anyway. But the coaches poll. So you had so that was also sort of interesting, as you had these dueling news agencies. UPI was one wire service that provided news around the country to magazines and newspapers, and then you had the AP, the Associated Press, UPI, AP. So you had the AP coaches, or the AP poll, which was just the AP poll, and then you had the coaches poll, which was run by the UPI. Somewhere along the way, they may not have always been associated with the UPI, and we still have the coaches poll, and I'm not even sure who runs that now. And we still have the AP poll. The AP poll is still out there, but we no longer look at the AP poll, even, which once upon a time was the gold standard. In most cases, while the coaches poll was respected, and a team certainly would claim a coaches national championship, a coaches poll national championship, I think most teams, most fans, what you really wanted to see was that AP. That was the gold standard. That was the number one choice, right? So, that was our system. So, and how did you get there? Well, you had 7, 8 conferences. You had a number of different conferences. You had, going back to the 1980s, you had the Big East, you had the Big 8, which eventually became the Big 12, but you had the Big 8, and so that was that was like Nebraska and Colorado. You had the Big East. Miami was a part of the Big East. You had, there was nobody else in the Big East that mattered, but Miami was. You had the ACC, you had the SEC, you had the Big 10, you had the Pac-10. You had the WAC. I always like saying the WAC, the Western Athletic Conference, and you would think they were almost entirely irrelevant, but BYU did win a national championship in the 1980s, and they were a member of the WAC. So the WAC is actually one of the conferences that we can say has a claim to a major national championship in this time frame. So we had 45 seasons of college football, and through most of that early time, the 80s and the 90s, and into the, I forgot exactly where the BCS picks up, but for most of the 80s and 90s at least, you got voted by the polls, and those conferences all had affiliations with their bowl games. So if the Rose Bowl forever was the winner of the Big 10, the Big Ten champion versus the Pac-10 champion. So it didn't matter whether either one of those teams. So let's say Ohio State won the Big Ten and they were the number one team in the country. And now we want to see if they're going to win the national championship. Well, they would go to their bowl game, but they would play the winner of the Pac-10. Well, let's say the winner of the Pac-10 went 9-3. It was ranked 18th in the country because there was a lot of other good teams that had 10 or more wins. So let's say they're 18th in the country. So you have the number one team in the country vying for the national championship, playing in the Rose Bowl, the granddaddy of them all, but playing a team that's, just in the teens, maybe not even in the high teens, for their bowl game. And in the meantime, let's say that in this scenario, you had Ohio State, the one I just gave, let's say they were undefeated, and now they're playing a 9-3 winner of the Pac-10, okay? And then let's say Alabama was your SEC champion, and they have one loss, and they are ranked number 2 coming into the bowl game. Well, our affiliation back in the 80s and 90s for the bowl game was the Sugar Bowl. So we would go to the Sugar Bowl. And other teams, there was different things. Notre Dame is an independent sometimes. Well, let's put Notre Dame. Let's say Notre Dame is also 11-1, but their loss was really ugly. Let's say they lost to somebody like they did last year, Northern Illinois, and so they're only ranked 4th. And somebody else is 3rd, let's say, And so this is how it could go, basically, is you could end up with the number 1 team in the Rose Bowl, the number 2 team. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. The number 2 team could be in the Sugar Bowl. The number 3 team could have been in the Cotton Bowl. Maybe they were a Big 8 team or something like that. So they go to the Cotton Bowl. And so these teams didn't play each other. And so you just had these sort of random wild affiliations where everybody's going around. And then once all the games were done on January 1st was super exciting. You sit down, you watch all these games. It's basically all day long from noon until midnight. And every game was sort of relevant to who's going to win the national championship. There wasn't one game. You had to watch that Rose Bowl to see what was going to happen there. Does the number 1 team win? Yes, they won, but we expected them to win because they were playing the number 17 team, so they should have won. And then did the number 2 team win? And so, in that scenario, typically if the number 1 team went to their bowl game and played and won, and they won convincingly, then they would probably stay number 1. But let's say they won, or let's say they lost. Now that opens the door for the number 2 and number 3 teams. But again, number 2 and number 3 aren't playing each other. So, and once number 1 lost in the scenario I just gave, let's say number 1 was undefeated, but number 2 and number 3 and number 4 all had one loss. So, and then number 1 would also still argue, by the way, like, hey, wait, we lost the Rose Bowl, but we only have one loss as well. So let's say number 2, 3, and 4 all end up with one loss. So now you have 4 teams that have one loss, and they're all right there in that top 4, and they all can claim, well, we played and beat the number 6 team, and well, we played and beat the number 7 team that was more powerful than the other, and you only played and you lost to the number 17 team. And they say, yeah, but during the season, your one loss was to an unranked team. So it was kind of chaos, right? Because that's that comparative thing that everybody would be looking at and try to see who it was. But it was fun. It was exciting. We all kind of had to sometimes wait. Sometimes you knew what would happen. Again, if in the first scenario I just gave, if the number 1 team that was undefeated won its bowl game, then you pretty much knew, okay, that's going to be the national champion. But if that number 1 team lost and all the other number 2, 3, and 4 teams all won their games, and you had 4 teams that were all with one loss, we often had to sit and wait until the next day or the day after, Monday. Like if all this happened on a Saturday or Sunday, then you might even have to wait till Monday. I don't remember, but it was usually at least a day or more before the poll would come out. And you'd get the newspaper, you'd wait to hear the announcement. Here's the poll, national champion, which hard to really imagine that you just sit around and wait a day or two after the game to see who is declared national champion, right? And that resulted in that scenario that I just described. That's where you got some of these things where you had split national champions. So that was the era. And then we moved into an era where nobody wanted that anymore. And so they started coming up with this idea of like, we got to get number 1 and number 2 to play. It's stupid to have an undefeated number 1 team and an undefeated number 2 team playing in different bowl games, and we don't get to see who really was. And it's not fair to just say, well, number 1 went in number 1 and they won their game. They're undefeated, so they're going to stay number 1. Number 2 won their game. But again, you get into comparing, well, whose game was more difficult? Well, whose schedule was it? It gets crazy to try and compare all that. And so It was fun. It was chaotic. It was a lot of arguing. And I think it led to the door being kind of wide open in one way to a lot of teams sneaking in there, or at least having a chance. But in another way, it was chaos. And I say it led to a lot of teams that, like BYU. Again, here's a team from the WAC, which was never a big time exciting conference, but they had the quarterback Jim McMahon, who would go on to be a Super Bowl winning quarterback with the Chicago Bears in the great Bears teams of the 1980s with Refrigerator Perry and all those guys. They won a Super Bowl or two. But Jim McMahon was the quarterback at BYU, and that team just caught the nation's attention. And that was sort of part of it, was getting the media attention, because they played in a crappy conference and they beat maybe one or two notable teams, but they played a lot of teams that were not super exciting, but they got the attention, and they had an electric player that was going to get drafted and go pro and did end up being a good pro player. And so it was a deserved attention on Jim McMahon, bringing some attention to that BYU program in a way where a lot of teams like that, and we still see that today, where a smaller school and a smaller conference will go out there and go undefeated, and everybody collectively yawns like, who cares, whatever, right? But they got the nation's attention, and they got up to number one, and what they were able to do, I think, and again, I haven't looked up that whole season, but basically I don't remember. I think there was just no other undefeated, untied teams that year, and you could have ties back then too, by the way. So there were no undefeated, and they were the only undefeated, untied team. And so they just kind of rose the rankings and made it up to, number one. I think they played in the Holiday Bowl that year, because I'm pretty sure that's what the WAC championship came out of. So again, sort of an absolute chaos model. I mean, your champion could play in any bowl game, even not even a January 1st bowl game, just depending on how the cookie crumbled, so to speak. But in a certain way, it sort of showed that there was a wide openness. I mean, you had this idea that, hey, especially after BYU made that run, that any team, you knew what the resume was, at least, which was to win all your games. If you went undefeated and untied, then that was the first sort of qualification that said you're going to be in the conversation, even if you're from a small school or a small conference. And then the second thing you had to do was then kind of promote yourself, or have the media or somebody promote you, because it's sort of a media driven thing, because basically it's like an election, right? I mean, it's a small number of electors. It's not the whole country going and casting ballots, but perception from how the country felt about teams certainly played into, and you could hear you might have heard the footsteps. The dog came in the room. So anyway, there's certainly perception of how the fans felt about teams and what the buzz was had to have some impact on those voters. So in a way, I guess what I'm saying is there was a certain wide openness to this. Now, the history of college football is dominated by the blue bloods and the heavyweights. You look around and you say, look, there's a certain number of teams that consistently rise to the top, and this is true in all sports. College football didn't invent this, and maybe college football is better or worse, and that's sort of the question we're trying to get at is, where are we heading in college football? Where were we? Where are we heading? And why is this relevant? Well, it's relevant to us today as Georgia fans, because it helps us understand, what are we looking for out of this season? What are our expectations? It has changed rapidly. There is a very different, it's widely acknowledged right now that where we are in college football and how we're going to pick a champion and what the champion is going to look like is very different than it was just 5 years ago when Georgia 4 or 5 years ago when Georgia was winning back-to-back national championships. So as Georgia fans, I think a lot of our consternation is, we keep looking at this team and saying, well, this team's not as good as those teams. And that's probably true. But I keep saying it, but there isn't any team that looks like what those teams look like. First of all, there was rarely ever any teams in the history of college football that looked like what Georgia looked like in 2021 and 2022. We had gotten to a place in the sport for one reason or another, and I don't think we'll unpack all this history today, because we want to get back to the Alabama game and keep talking about this season. But we'll talk about it some more somewhere. But there was a time, or I think what did happen, that sort of was with peak Georgia there, 2021, 22. That was sort of the end. Nick Saban had established it. I mentioned LSU was in there with their 2019 team. Clemson was in there with the best teams that Dabo had in that 4 or 5 year run where they won 2 national championships. You had juggernaut teams. You had teams where they had just stockpiled so much talent and they were so much better than everybody else. And that hadn't been the case. And that's, I guess, what I was thinking about. My perspective about this sort of 1980s, 1990s time frame was when I first started getting excited and interested as a fan, as a kid about college football. What I saw was this sort of wide open thing. I saw the BYU thing, right? I saw where a team could get an exciting player or two and maybe one great player. I mean, and let's be honest. Look, Georgia was always a great team, or a really good team. They always played, they were well coached under Vince Dooley. They had great defenses. They were disciplined, and you knew what you were getting. But the main difference between 1980 national championship Georgia and every other Vince Dooley team was Herschel Walker, right? I mean, that's why we celebrate Herschel Walker so much. And it wasn't just that he was the best player on the Georgia team. He was one of the best players we've ever seen in college football. So some of you out there may be embarrassed about his Senate run, from a couple of years. I mentioned this before. Look, let's just focus on and reflect on Herschel Walker, the Bulldog player, and the guy who loves Georgia football and has always represented the University of Georgia well, and has always been willing to give back and be a part of the University of Georgia community. And who did come back and get his degree and finish his degree at the University of Georgia. So congratulations. We talked about that earlier in the season, but just felt like I needed to throw a quick word in there about Herschel Walker. But let's never lose sight of the fact that Herschel Walker is one of the greatest players in the history of college football. He overwhelmed the sport. He overwhelmed the other players, and he overwhelmed the sport. And so you could take what was already a good team with a solid defense and then add Herschel Walker, and now all of a sudden, maybe you don't have the juggernaut like 2021 Georgia, 2022 Georgia that can beat you in every phase of the game. You also did have Kevin Butler. You had a guy who could kick a 60-yard field goal, as was proved more than once, or close to, or at least, so you did have, you had all the pieces. It was a solid team. But without Herschel Walker, this wasn't a team. We didn't have an amazing wide receiver corps. We had some guys who made plays, right, and could make a play here or there. You had a quarterback who didn't make a lot of mistakes, but Buck Bellew, love hearing him on radio here in Metro Atlanta area, love his insights, love his, connections with Georgia, baseball, you name it. Buck Bellew's a great guy, and I enjoy him as a personality and celebrate him as a national champion Georgia player, and he deserves all that credit. But, Buck Bellew was not, a future NFL Hall of Famer quarterback. And we knew that even when he was at Georgia and playing. And really very few, until I brought up the other day about Eric Zier. Until you got to Eric Zier, you didn't really have, Fran Tarkington when Fran Tarkington played at Georgia, he went on to have a prolific NFL career, but it's also, he threw for like 40,000 yards in the NFL, which when he retired was like the record. And now there's several guys way over 60,000 yards in their career, right? But at that time, Fran Tarkington was like the most prolific passing quarterback, and he could also run, but he was the most prolific passing quarterback in the history of the NFL when he retired. At Georgia, he probably threw just a hand. He didn't throw the ball that much when he was the quarterback at Georgia, and he ran a lot. That's how college football was. So it's a little bit of a surprise that he actually would go pro and become the most prolific passer of all time. That's just, that's how college football was. So BYU, Jim McMahon comes along. He's a huge personality, and he's just this guy who just wills and grits the team to wins. And they go undefeated, and they win the national championship. So you used to be able to build a champion. A championship team was usually a team that emerged with a combination of things. Often it was a team that had a good piece, like a really good offense, but their defense was terrible. And then they had they got one or two really good defensive players, and their defense came along and then helped support them. Or maybe they were a decent overall team, but then you got a great quarterback like Jim McMahon. Or in Georgia's case, you had a good overall team. You had a couple nice pieces. You were not an offensive juggernaut, but you had a great defense. And then you add a Herschel Walker, and that totally complemented that defense, because what does he do? He controls the game. Georgia eats up the clock. Just run, run, run. You can't stop Herschel. Georgia has the ball for 40 minutes. Maybe they don't put up 40 or 50 points, but they didn't have to. They put up, 27 points, and they beat you 27-3 because you had the ball like 3 times, and you never could stop Herschel Walker. And Georgia's defense was better than your defense. So it was a winning formula. But that's how those teams were built. There were very few just like dynastically great teams that just could beat you in every phase of the game, like Alabama did most of the time under Nick Saban, or like Georgia did in 2021 or 2022, or LSU did in 2019. That just wasn't how teams were built. And the sport ascended to that in the playoff era, and in part because the consolidation of conferences, the consolidation of TV rights, and the playoff era has just brought ever more money into it. So some teams and some leaders, Nick Saban being really maybe the first to recognize the value of saying, we're going to spend. And, so Nick Saban invented ideas we don't hear about or talk about a lot. I mean, he had former head coaches from the NFL on staff as quality control analysts, right? Watching practice, watching game tape, and giving them feedback and saying, look, I see that if, the right guard can, pull out here a little more frequently and block here, you're going to, just little tiny details. And they developed a budget for staff and recruiting that hadn't been seen before. And so they went into, basically sort of a war chest building mode of building talent. And we know about the recruiting, but that was also done with money and manpower. They had bigger staffs and more money invested in football than anybody ever had. But this was a smart move for Alabama, because Alabama, the university, has had record enrollments. They have been bringing in people from all around the country, especially from the Northeast. There have been people who, when deciding when to come to college, are coming from out of state to go to Alabama. Alabama's enrollments, money, contribution, everything just exploding. Campus, in the time I've mentioned, that I've sort of married into Alabama, so I'm familiar with them. Just in the time I've been familiar with Alabama, since I married into going over to Alabama once or twice a year and walking around campus and learning about the place. I'd never been there in college. So, again, we didn't play Alabama. So I never went to Alabama. I didn't have any friends that went to Alabama. I knew a lot of people that went to Auburn. I knew a lot of people that went to, I knew some people that went to Clemson. I knew people that went to, definitely people from Florida. I just never had a reason to go to Alabama. But once I married in the 90s and then 2000s, I started learning about Alabama. Well, in that time, since I've been a part of be walking around the Alabama campus from time to time, they're like every place, but the money and the enrollment has just exploded, and it's been fantastic for the university. Same thing has happened at Clemson, not back to back, but 2 national championships in 5 years. And the profile of Clemson, you drive through Atlanta to Charlotte, and you drive through Anderson, South Carolina, and you go past Clemson. Clemson has a huge research facility and beautiful buildings and fancy signs and everything all out by the highway now. And the same thing, there are kids that are coming down from the Northeast and all around the country to go to Clemson, and Clemson couldn't even outdraw people in this area, much less than bring people from other parts of the country. So the realization that you don't have to be embarrassed about your football greatness, but that your football greatness can lead you to university greatness, that you can have a great university with a high reputation and you can have a great football program. In fact, those two maybe go together, has really been something that came together along with all this money flooding in from TV and the consolidation of conferences and more games on TV with the playoffs and championship games for conferences. And Nick Saban, pioneered taking that money and plowing it back into football to make a good investment that's paid off for the university. And, Kirby Smart has replicated that model as well. And so, and other people were doing that, and they use that to build a juggernaut. But now that you have NIL, now that you have transfer portals, now that everybody can pay directly even, that you can have a football budget and pay players. Well, now you don't just have to look at 1 or 2 schools that are out ahead of everybody else in an arms race, in a war, spending more money and war chesting in a different way. Now you can see that anybody like Texas Tech, and we haven't talked about them a lot yet, but I was listening to Joel Klatt again this week, and I was just reminded that Texas Tech is out there sort of hovering around the top 10 or 15 without us really spending any time or thinking about them, because they're somewhere else right now. But we're going to hear about Texas Tech before the season is over, I think. And one of the things that's probably been under talked about for a lot of us fans over here in the SEC and around this part, we're all focused on who right around here and who are the perennial players that are going to be part of this national championship. Well, Texas Tech has spent a ton of money, and it's not shocking. There's tons of money in Texas, right? So there's plenty of people in Texas who can get together and say, wait a minute, I want in on this. We don't have to just sit around and except that we're a smaller school in a small conference playing behind Texas A&M and Texas and everybody else in football. We've got money. We've got a nice town. We've got a stadium. We can spend whatever we want. And so they've gone out and they've spent a huge amount of money, and they brought in a better defense, better offense. They're a solid team. I don't know a ton about them yet, but I'm just saying they're a factor, and we can't ignore them. And we may be forced to not ignore them before the season's over. And so here's an example where, all of a sudden you don't have to build the old way. So what was the old way? Let me get back to that before we run out of time. This segment is turning into forever. And I know I do that a lot, but so what am I trying to get at? Well, I'm trying to get at, so you had the 1980s, and the 1980s was the bowl and pole era, right? So but you knew what your job was. Your job was to go out there and try to win your conference, go undefeated or one loss, because you never saw a national champion that had any more than one loss. So you knew, didn't matter who you played and if you lost to. If you're Georgia and you played Florida and you'd lost to Florida, but you otherwise had beaten a couple other top-ranked teams and you're up there around number 3 or number 4 in the country, what you couldn't do is you could not go lose to unranked Vanderbilt. Even though Vanderbilt, and even though you might still win the conference, let's say you still somehow with 2 losses, you still tied as co-champion. And we did. We had some years where we were co-champion of the SEC. And in those days, they used to do that. Everybody didn't play everybody in the SEC. So there were some years you look at the SEC championship rolls, and there's 3 teams listed because maybe 3 different teams all went 6-2, didn't play each other, and there wasn't that was in the pre-conference championship game era. So what did they do? They just said, okay, they're all champions. There's no way to distinguish. So champion of the SEC this year, Alabama, Florida, Georgia. They all went 6-2. Okay. So you wanted to win your conference, have the least number of losses possible. And you kind of knew that needed to be 1 or 0 in the poll era because there was no such thing as a 2-loss champion. So we didn't get to the 2-loss championship era until we got to the whole BCS. The BCS was the idea of where you say, look, we're going to play the bowls, and then we're going to play one more game. We're going to take the number 1 team and the number 2 team. After everything's done, the bowls, we're going to put them in an extra game, one more championship game. So it's so the bowls become like a weird, complicated semifinal where a whole bunch of different team games produce 2 teams. It's not exactly a single semifinal, but we pick 2 teams out of a bunch of different teams, and then we put them in the game. And then so again, you get back to the same thing I've already alluded to. I beat you, you beat me, they beat him, you lost to him. Your loss is worse than my my worst law or my one loss is better than your best win, and these kind of arguments. So this is what I was trying to get at. So now you're arguing schedule. So then they came up with, and if you watch the SEC shorts that I alluded to this week, the SEC shorts was hilarious. They discarded things of college football past. Maybe this is what maybe got me thinking about football past. Maybe we have to blame SEC shorts for this podcast today. But in the SEC short, they featured the BCS computer. And in that era, we heard so much about the BCS computer because immediately to try to ameliorate this problem with everybody complaining about schedules and how these teams didn't play each other. You got 100 and something teams, none of them play each other, all in different conferences. You're looking at who was ranked, and they're like, well, we beat the number 3 team. It's like, yeah, they were number 3 when you beat them, but they lost 3 more games and they didn't even finish in the top 25. All this comparative discussion, right? And so they tried to systematize it a little bit, and the era of computers brought this opportunity to say, hey, we could have a computer tell us the answer. So they created the BCS computer, and the BCS computer formula, same thing we've talked about before, though, the old mantra from the 80s of computing, garbage in, garbage out. The computer can only tell you what you tell it, basically. You give it the data, and you tell it how to rank the data, and then it gives you back an answer. But so you still had a bias. There's still the human bias. Whoever programmed the computer programmed a certain bias into that computer to say, this is what you do with that information. And each year, the computer would spit out its rankings, and I don't even remember for sure. It wasn't 100% the computer ranking. It was like the human polls was a percentage of it, and then a percentage of it was the computer poll, and the computer would spit out its ranking. They put it together, and they would get a BCS cofactor or a number come out like 2.1 or whatever. I mean, it was this weird number that came out of combining, a certain percentage of your poll, your coach's poll, your AP poll, and then your computer ranking. And so these 3 things came in, and then everybody complained about the computer ranking in part because they knew it was manipulable. You can't go tell an AP voter. I mean, you can say, the AP screwed it up, but who do you go to? So they went to the people who ran the BCS kept changing the play. They say every year they come out and say, well, you guys were right. You complained bitterly and we listened to you. And so we're going to change the formula. And now we're going to emphasize, strength of schedule, or now we're going to take away, anything over a 21-point win, we're not going to count that anymore, because there was this complaint that coaches were encouraged to run up the score. If you're Georgia playing Austin P and you can win 73-0, well, you try to do it, because it was understood that the computer formula would give you bonus credit for margin of victory. So, if you could just beat down really crappy teams, your margin of victory could be huge. And so you could kind of cheat the computer, right? So they were always tweaking this idea, but that was the +1 system was the idea of the BCS. We're going to play one more game and then we'll get a true champion on the field, because number 1, number 2 will play. And the consternation from that led to the 4-team playoff was that there was always this sense that we picked one, maybe not both of the teams. A lot of years, I think at least one of those teams was obvious. But in a lot of years, probably the number 2 team was not obvious. You could make an argument for 2 or 3 teams, going back to that original bowl scenario I depicted, where maybe you have one going into the bowls, one undefeated team, and 3 teams that are in the top 5 that all have one loss, and they all played in different conferences. They all lost to different people. So who's the best among that group? I don't know. So that's what they tried to figure out. So then they said, how about a playoff? But we've always had this idea that we want to preserve the college football season. It's special. Again, knowing that you had to win all your games, or maybe you could lose one and be in the conversation, meant that every game you play, like I said, even if you're playing unwon Vanderbilt, instead of undefeated, let's say you're playing an 0-9 Vanderbilt team and you're undefeated, you lose that game to Vanderbilt, that may cost you a national championship. Even though in pro sports, that would just be a league loss, and as long as you won the league, you would advance and go on to the playoffs. So that's why the drama isn't there. When they talk about, ruining the drama of the season, in pro sports, in pro football, it doesn't matter who you lose to. You win a game, you lose a game. If you win your conference, you're going to advance to the playoff, right? And then you get in the playoff, and then anything can happen. So, and we're moving towards that system. So now we've introduced the 4-team playoff. And so the 4-team playoff, goes for 10 years. And now we're in the 12-team playoff era. So what was I saying? Going back to looking at last year's playoff, we only have the 12-team playoff so far. Well, the 4-team playoff still elicited this discussion about, number 5 or number 6. But in reality, I think most college football experts and most of us fans could look at it in most years and say, it's not even clear that the 4th team deserved to be it. I mean, again, go back to our second national championship in this time, the 2022 national championship. TCU, did they deserve to be there? I don't know. I don't remember all the context of the other teams that were an option. I mean, let's say for sure Alabama wasn't in that playoff that year. Okay. They probably, every year that Nick Saban was coaching, you could have argued Alabama was one of the 4 best teams in the country. It was just a matter of who won, who lost. So when you look at talent, you go back and you compare to how a Georgia and Alabama game went in that era and the TCU Georgia game went. TCU didn't have they're not as good a team as Alabama. They weren't as good a program. It's probably true that Alabama from that year was a better team than TCU. So if we were truly picking the 4 best teams, then, TCU probably didn't deserve to be there. But the problem is Alabama lost in a way that season that made it seem reasonable. Nobody was that overwhelmed that Alabama was left out. I mean, I'm sure Alabama fans were unhappy, but I just remember the concept being that, hey, they lost the game and had a chance. Look, same thing happened to us last year of the playoff. Carson Beck's first season as starter. Again, as I've said many a time, looking back at that team, this is an opportunity loss. This is one of the games where Alabama cost us, right? We don't know for sure what we cost, because ultimately Michigan goes on to be undefeated and win that championship. We can't say for sure that had we gotten in the playoff, we'd have beaten Michigan. Alabama took our spot. We were undefeated going into the SEC championship game. Alabama was a 1-loss team that looked less good throughout the season, but with Nick Saban coaching and all the other things about them, they still get to the SEC championship game. They're ranked behind Georgia. They come into the game as an underdog. Georgia is the clear favorite, the two-time reigning national champion, 29 straight victories, number one team. So everything is on our side, and Alabama outplays us in the game just by a little bit. They make less mistakes than us. We talked about this already. I won't rehash it too much, but they win the game. So they take our spot. And yeah, there's some bitching from Georgia fans, and there's some complaining from other people that if you look at the four best teams, there's no way that Georgia isn't one of the four best teams, even having lost that game. I mean, if that's what the playoff was supposed to be, four best teams, clearly Georgia is one of those four best teams, right? So in that season. But we accepted it, and a lot of college football accepted it. A lot of the national announcers and talking heads and people accepted it because the way the system was set up, the SEC championship game is a stepstone towards that playoff. So we earned the right to be in the SEC championship game by going undefeated. Alabama earned its right to be there, and they were a one-loss team. And then they beat us on the field. So now we're both one-loss teams, and they are the SEC champion, and we're not. We're probably still a better team than them. And we're certainly better than at least one or two of the other teams that make it into that playoff, because there's no doubt in my mind that that team is still one of the four best teams in college football. But everybody accepts that, look, the system Georgia played they had their opportunity. If they'd won the SEC championship game, they're in. Okay, we didn't. So again, that game cost us not only an SEC championship, it cost us a playoff spot, obviously. And Alabama gets the game against Michigan. It's a slogfest, and Michigan pulls it out, but it's close the whole game. And I just think that we would have been the better matchup against Michigan. And I think there's a good chance we beat Michigan in that first game. And then Michigan gets a shot at Washington, Kalen DeBoer's old team, okay, and they throttle them. And if Michigan could have throttled them, I think we could have throttled them. So you can't just associative property say we definitely would have won that national championship. I said that about the 2012 SEC championship loss, where Alabama beat us, and the waiting opponent in that other game, that the way the structure of the playoff BCS thing was set up then, was going to be Notre Dame. And Notre Dame was a paper tiger. They were undefeated. But again, this is that comparative thing. They were undefeated, playing their schedule had not been great, and the teams on their schedule didn't hold up, and they got clobbered, and we would have clobbered them too. I mean, that one I think you can give us, and I've said that already, but it just keeps coming back to it. So because part of this week, what we're doing is we're focusing on that idea of what has this Georgia-Alabama rivalry, if it's a rivalry, or at least what has this series meant. And it's meant right now that Alabama has cost Georgia a ton. Okay, we've still accomplished a ton, and the measuring stick that has been Alabama has also elevated us to a certain degree. Certainly when we won the one national championship game against them, but it's cost us a ton. They beat us in the 2018 national championship game. For one play, we're national champion. They win, they're national champion. So there's a championship lost. The 2023 SEC championship, we lost an SEC championship. We lost a playoff berth and a shot at another national championship. And I think we would have had fair odds in that. So, these are opportunities lost. But my point being is TCU, going back to our 2021, TCU was not better than Alabama. They probably didn't really deserve to be in that playoff. So even the 4-team playoff, and look, we can do a deeper dive into that and go bigger into all of the opponents or all of the teams that made each of the 10 years of the 4-team playoff. But just take it on, you might remember it some, but just trust me, I've looked at this before, and we're running short on time. We're getting near as much time as we should take today. So I'm not going to go into all of those, but just suffice it to say that a lot of times that fourth team is questionably whether it should have even been there. And the results have showed that. A lot of the semifinals and a couple of the championship games haven't even been competitive. And anything can happen in a game. Again, there's 3 true outcomes in a game. One team wins by a blowout, the other team wins by a blowout, or it's a nip and tuck game. So there's always the chance one team can blow out. And sometimes a game gets away from a team. Doesn't prove a team was terrible, but sometimes it does. So we're always looking to judge that. What does it mean in this case? So going back to last year's playoff, you get teams in there: SMU, Indiana, probably Tennessee. Ultimately, when we go back and look at it, I mean, Tennessee was in that discussion the whole time as a playoff team, but that's where we left looking at last year's playoff when I went off on this discussion and brought in the history a little bit. Tennessee, though, when we really look at them, we saw how they played against us. They come in with 2 losses. They finished 10-3 last year as a playoff team. They finished in the top 10, but they were the number 9 team. And maybe that's fine, the number 9 team. But again, in the history, going back into the old days, either in the bowl and poll era, or even in the BCS era, or even in the 4-team playoff era, in none of those eras is last year's Tennessee team a factor in the playoff / national championship. And in reality, they were exposed as not being a factor when they got into the game. They got into that playoff, but it's easy to look at Indiana and call them charity. But the reality is Tennessee's birth turned out to be charity as well. They made the playoff, but when we really look at the last 40, 45 years of college football, they wouldn't have been a team that would have sniffed a national championship in the bowl and poll era, in the BCS era, or in the 4-team playoff era. They were only a team that made the 12-team playoff era, and they were bounced right out of it by a superior team playing at home. So when you got to the second round, you had the teams like us that had the bye. So, but we had Notre Dame. Notre Dame proved to be a legitimate team last year. They were worthy of being in the conversation for at least a hard-nosed, tough team. I mean, they were not a complete team, and they ultimately lost, but they made it to the national championship game. You had Oregon was another seed. They got beat by Ohio State, which at this point's on a heater for some reason. Arizona State had been your Big 12 champion, I guess, and so they got the bye, and they got to play Texas, who had advanced by beating Clemson at home. And then that was actually a close game, and Arizona State could have won that game. So Arizona State, last year's Arizona State team acquitted themselves well, I would say. I mean, they gave Texas all they could handle, and when you go back and look at the details of that game, the Texas could have easily lost that game. They were at least as fortunate as we were to pull out the Tennessee game, to pull out that playoff game. And then you had Boise was grafted in as your champion of your smaller conference, and again, uncompetitive against Penn State, and none of us are big believers in Penn State, right? Penn State turns around and loses their next game to Notre Dame. So, of course, we lost to Notre Dame, so that doesn't mean that they're, it's all terrible, but I'm just saying, that was a close game. That was a 27-24 game. So, I mean, Notre Dame just pulled that out. So, I mean, Penn State probably, again, Penn State, in that playoff format, Penn State's legit, but I guess what I was going to say is we can go back and look for a second. And where did I have this? The last year's poll. So we've talked about the bowl and poll. So we said we got the bowl and poll era. You've got the BCS. You've got the BCS era. Then you have the 4-team playoff era, and now we're in the 12-team era. So I think it's interesting to look at these teams and say, like I just did with Tennessee, and say, would they have been a part of any of these other championships? This is what we know now about, or this is how we gauge what the new 12-team playoff era is doing to college football. Is we can look at those teams and say, well, would they have been a part of any other version of winning a national championship? And was that reasonable? I mean, look, the bowl and poll era, like I said, was sort of crazy and silly in a way, but in a way, I mean, it did demand a certain level of high-level achievement. Again, nobody ever won a national championship with 2 losses in that era. I mean, you had to win, you had to go undefeated. Typically, again, the resume, you knew what you had to do when you started the season. You had to try to go undefeated. You could get there if you didn't go undefeated, but you needed to try to win your conference and go undefeated. That was what was gonna put you in the conversation. And then the rest of it was going to be just like we're talking about this season. It's going to be comparative. How do you compare against the other teams that went either undefeated or 1 loss and won their conference? And are you going to get a chance to play them? The original bowl, the big flaw of the bowl and poll era was that the bowls didn't regularly put those teams together. So it made it even crazier. And the choosing at the end was a little bit haphazard. The BCS, as bad as it was with all the computer discussion, at least tried to consolidate and get the teams together so we could see the teams play each other and have something to vote on when hopefully number 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 play each other, right? And then the 4-team playoff era just took that to another level, the top 4 teams. And so you always got somebody wherever you draw the line. We used to have a 32 team NCAA basketball field. Then it went to 64. Now we have the play-in. Now it's 68 teams and they're talking about expanding it some more. So you have the 4 teams playing in, and there's always this argument. I mean, you always have this discussion, and you see these coaches when you get to the NCAA tournament, and they're like the last 4 in, and the guy who gets left out. Well, we went 18-12, but we were 10-6 in our conference, and we were awesome, and our power index and whatever, we should have been in the okay. You went 18-12. When's the last time you saw an 18-12 team win the national championship? Okay, yes, you maybe you could have got in the playoff, and it would have been into the NCAA tournament. It would have been exciting for your fans and everything. But come on, nobody. I mean, once in a while you see a team. I mean, the last team that, probably the only team that ever advanced like that, like I think the NC State team, the Jim Valvano team of the 80s, that I think they were like 24-12 by the time they won 4 to 6 games in the tournament. So when they won the national championship that year and got into the tournament, and they were like maybe an 8 or an 11 seed or something like that, and maybe not. I'd have to go back and look that up. But the point, I mean, once in a while you see an 8 or an 11 seed get into the Final Four, but none of those have advanced and won. So you still end up usually, for all the upsets and everything, at the end of most seasons, the Final Four ends up being like 3 1 seeds and an 8 seed. So, and then the 8 seed gets bounced in the first game, in the semifinal game, and then we go on to have a final game between real teams, and that's what's happening in the college football playoff too. Last year's final college football rankings, or AP rankings, Oregon number 1, Georgia. This is the college football playoff ranking. Oregon was number 1, Georgia number 2, Texas number 3, Penn State number 4. Now, the seedings were different than that because of all these rules and things, and they keep tweaking that. But if this was the 4-team playoff era, and there's no seedings and no conference affiliations, just these 4 teams, then last year's 4-team playoff would have been number 1 Oregon versus number 4 Penn State, and number 2 Georgia versus number 3 Texas, which in a way would have been terrible, because we would have been playing Texas literally back-to-back SEC championship games. So we already played them in the regular season, turn around and we played them in the SEC championship, and then literally the next game we would have played would have been a semifinal against them in the playoff. Now that would have been terrible, and I don't know what our chances on that would be, just because the history of teams playing each other you play somebody 3 times in a row, surely they're going to win. If they're pretty equally matched, surely they're going to win one of them, right? I mean, although the Georgia-Bama series right now exception, right? So the AP poll kind of had it very similar. If you went by the AP poll, it was Oregon, Georgia, Notre Dame, Texas. So Notre Dame was the team that just got left out by the playoff committee. If you went by so again, owing to the idea that Notre Dame was legit, right? And they did advance to the national championship game. So they would have been left out, according to the final poll, they would have been left out of the 4-team playoff. They ultimately were a 7 seed in this version of the playoff, in the 12-team playoff. If you use the AP poll as the seedings, it would have been Oregon versus Texas in the first game and Georgia Notre Dame. And we did see the Georgia Notre Dame game, and so maybe we saw that outcome already play itself out. So Oregon and Texas then would have had one game against each other, and then one game, let's say Notre Dame still beats Georgia in that scenario, and then Oregon, the winner of Oregon Texas, plays Notre Dame for the national champion. And I think pretty good chance that either of those beat that Notre Dame team in the same way Ohio State did. So again, here's our perspective. Here, what do we take from all this? I mean, on and on we talk about this. And what does this mean? Okay, well, it's easy to lose sight of now because Ohio State's back at number 1. Everybody's giving them all the praise of like, oh my God. And of course, I don't know how great it was to beat Texas. We're not really sure yet. I mean, their offense and Arch Manning are struggling. Their defense looks legit. But, and again, same thing I keep saying, right? No matter which team you look at, there's flaws. So this is my whole point, I guess, to try to circle this back together. We're in an era where we've kind of gone back to the 80s and 90s, where there are no juggernaut teams. And can you put together just enough pieces, and can you sort of spit and duct tape something together? Like, can you take Texas's really great looking defense, but that is a reloading defense? They lost 2 or 3 of their top defenders to the NFL, but they still have what looks like an elite defense. And they had some nice offensive pieces last year, and they were supposed to have a quarterback who was going to step in and be at least as good as the guy they had last year or better. And right now that hasn't been the case. But let's say their offense is just pretty good. okay? But their defense is killer. Well, they play in the SEC. They're going to play. They're going to have the schedule to qualify to get to the playoff. And then when they get to the playoff, they've got enough talent up and down their roster, and they're going to feature a really great defense. And defense in this, and we're seeing defense really be a factor. A lot of the big games this year have been more defensive than not. The Georgia-Tennessee game is really one of the aberrations, and the Notre Dame Texas A&M game. Those are two games that have busted the mold so far. Almost all the other big matchups we've looked at so far in this early first quarter of the season, the big matchups have been 20-something or less games, like the Clemson LSU game, which was 17-10. Now we're already looking at both those teams and saying, well, wait a minute, LSU can't do anything on offense. Their defense looks great, and Clemson's no good. So that's how fast our review of these games and things changes. But point being is, I think we've come back to an era where it looks a little bit more like the 80s, which is to say that there's no more juggernaut teams. And what you did in the 80s, I started saying this, but I didn't quite finish the thought, was a lot of times the way a national champion was built was you had a team where you assembled talent together over a couple of years and you got some experience. And by the time you had some players who'd been together, it was generally thought you couldn't win with a team that was full of freshmen and sophomores and maybe just a few juniors and very few seniors. The idea was always that you needed to have guys with experience. And so when you saw a team that was predominantly good players, maybe a few future NFLers, or maybe at least just really good college football players, but that team was full of juniors and seniors, that was a team that people looked at and said, hey, maybe this is their year. And maybe you added a piece, again, like a Herschel Walker. When Herschel Walker came into a veteran defensive team and a team that had been a competitive and good team, when he came in and just became a lightning rod to a team with an already really good defense, now you had a championship formula. And we're seeing that right now. Now, he just got hurt. John Mateer, as it turns out, got hurt in the Oklahoma-Auburn game and had to have hand surgery. And this may change. Depends on how fast he gets back and whatnot, but this may change Oklahoma's trajectory a little bit. But Oklahoma looked pretty legit, and whether or not they're a legitimate national title contender, at the moment they look like a team that definitely could make the playoff. Whether or not they're a team that can run through the playoff or not, I don't know. We haven't quite got to that yet. But Mateer was getting buzz as a Heisman candidate. He's one of the best quarterbacks in the nation so far this year. And he has transformed Oklahoma, right? Oklahoma was a miserable team on offense. They couldn't score, if you spun them around and just pointed them to the end zone with no defense. They would fall down short of the end zone, it seemed like last year, if there was nobody there. They were just could not score. And then now Mateer comes in, they got some new wide receivers, just a couple people, and it changes their fortune. And one of the things, going back to Clemson for a minute, people have been trying to figure out what's going wrong with Clemson. Clemson looked like we talked about at the beginning of the season, what I just talked about. Clemson looked like one of those teams like, hey, they got a veteran defense. They got a veteran offense, some offensive line pieces that have been there a little bit. They got a veteran quarterback, 2-3 years in the system. This may be their year. Well, what was a difference maker? Well, they had been like us last year. It was like they didn't have competitive wide receivers. But this year, they're supposed to have, really good wide receivers. And one guy in particular, and I can't think of his name right now. I think it's like Antonio Williams or something. But anyway, he ends up getting hurt in the first game against LSU. I think he only played part of that game, and then he didn't play the subsequent games. Well, there's a big chance that we're at the place now again. And this was true. You think back as a Georgia fan, you remember this. Our team used to be much thinner. We might have been considered, we were often in the top 10, top 15, top 8 teams in the country in recruiting and in results. We were hovering around that top 10, especially under Mark Richt, right? But how many of those teams, when Todd Gurley got suspended for the stupid autograph signing thing, when AJ Green got suspended for 4 games to start the season for the selling his jersey from the game, the bowl game the year before, you remember how that changed our whole trajectory of our team? One guy, AJ Green, couldn't play for 4 games, and we went 1-3 to start the season. And we were no longer a factor in the SEC and national championship that season. We were a factor the year when Todd Gurley, we were in the SEC and national championship discussion. And then this thing comes out where sometime in the past, not during that season, like back in the summer or whatever, investigation comes up. Todd Gurley, it's like, oh no, they're investigating him. And then a week or 2 later, it's like, Oh, now he's going to be suspended. Then we're waiting to find out. Ultimately, he gets suspended for 4 games, right? And we fall out of the race. I don't remember exactly what happened in those games, but that was a huge factor. Like yes, Todd Gurley was a transcendent player, but that's sort of my point is the current recent era of the Alabama and Georgia teams and that LSU team I keep referencing, Ohio State, to a certain degree, no one player, even the best player in the country, could get hurt or be suspended for some reason off of one of those teams. And generally speaking, those teams could still steamroll through other people. But we're back to a place now where teams are much more thinly built. So you get a good defense here, and you add a superstar pass rusher and maybe an elite quarterback, or you get an offense that's not quite clicking. You add 1 or 2 wide receivers or a great running back, and all of a sudden they're a contender. You get a team with that already had a great offense all the way around, but they really didn't have anything exceptional at defense, and you get a couple top defenders to join that team, and now all of a sudden, boom, they're a contender. That's more how the 80s were. That's more how the 90s were, is that you had experience, you had people, you built a roster, you got some experience, you added 1 or 2 pieces, and then you needed some breaks. That was the other part of it, right? And you saw all these fluky plays. Colorado's 1990 national championship season included getting a 5th down in a game against Nebraska. If they don't get 5th down, they lose. If they lose that game, they're not national champion. So sometimes you needed some breaks. Sometimes you needed a big 4th down play. Sometimes you needed a Hail Mary or a 50-something yard field or a 60-yard Kevin Butler field goal to win it and stay in the contention. And that's how that era was. So the big perspective here, what's changed? Well, the bowl and pull era gave us a more wide open field. And in that time, college football was more wide open and the wealth was spread a little bit more. People went all over the place and they hadn't built this sort of amazing, juggernaut teams. And that wouldn't come till the money and the consolidation of conferences and money came up recently. But now we've kind of undone that. Now we've undone that because now NIL and portal, and we keep referencing NIL and portal, but I wanted to talk about that and say, what does it mean? Why is it different? Where has it gone? Well, what it's done is it's taken us back to an era where teams couldn't consolidate in an arms race of just stockpiling talent. Recruiting still matters. You still need a ton of talent. And Georgia still has it. Texas still has it. Alabama, Ohio State. These are all teams that still have it. Penn State, we're looking at this year as a team that not only has talent, but they invested in their money in keeping some of those veteran guys around who maybe could have gone ahead and gone pro so they could make a run. You used to see that. That was something that sometimes happened, is like, would a guy return for his 3rd or 4th year? I mean, you usually had to return for your 3rd year dependent. You had to be, well, the rule still is you have to be 3 years removed from your high school season. So if you redshirted and then you only played 2 seasons, Mark Richt admitted that was a huge mistake with Noshan Marino. College football had changed already where guys are definitely going to go pro after 3 seasons removed from their high school year. So the old idea of keeping freshmen redshirted and on the bench and then uncork them later, again, the concept was experience won out, and you build experience and you add talent and experience and you put it together in the right time. You might catch lightning in a bottle, go undefeated, win a national championship. That's kind of, put it all together. It was kind of like a mix, stir it together, bake the cake and see if it comes out champion. That's kind of how it was in the bowl and pull era. And slowly but surely, we've been moving towards an era where people could target the exact formula to how they could overwhelm the system. They could war chest the system. They could beat the system and take the controls out, take control of it. And that's how we got to these juggernaut teams. And now that's been undone by NIL and portal. The fact that people can freely transfer, the fact that a guy can maybe get a better offer and more money to go to a different team. And, now it's being spread around. The talent's being spread around. We're not going to see those juggernaut teams anymore. So we've been saying that, but why and what does it mean? Well, it looks much more like this bowl and pull era. Now, the one thing that's still going to be different, and this is where I think it's not as great for the sport, and is that the bowl and pull era was wide open. So I'm going to close. I think actually we're going to end up getting back to breaking down the defense and the offense comparisons on Alabama tomorrow. We're just going to finish up on this long retrospective today, and that'll be the rest of our thing today. So segment 1 will be our only segment today. Just a very long segment. But I mentioned before, I broke this down and looked at it. In the 45 seasons from 1980 to now, like I said, there have been 49 teams that actually claimed national champions because we had 4 years where we had split or shared national champions. But one thing we're seeing is we're seeing an ever smaller group emerge in the teams. In the 1980s, so this is, from 80 to 89, 90 to 99, so each of these eras I went through and I counted. So there were 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm not really sure what I said. I wrote down there was 10. There was, because of, okay, not sure why I wrote 10. I guess there was 10 national championships, but I don't know. There were 10 different national champions, or 10 national championships. Anyway, there weren't the splits. Let me get to this. Here's what I'm trying to say. So in the 1980s, 7 teams claimed a national championship. And that's because Penn State won 2, and I think Miami also won 2. So you had a couple teams. So you still had teams that were, could win more than one in a short period of time. It wasn't just a one and done thing, although that was somewhat common too. But so you had 7 teams. The 1990s, and this is again my peak fandom. Like, I've been a fan now for several years. I'm getting to the point where I'm really starting to understand the game better, and I'm understanding how the statistics and the different parts of it. So for me, the 1990s was this sort of like golden age, because in the 1990s, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different teams. That's what it was. So there's 10 different teams that share 13 claimed national. So 13 national titles were handed out in the 10 seasons of the 90s, because we had a couple splits. But you had 10 different teams. So going back in 1980, so the teams that won a championship in the 1980s, Georgia, Clemson, Penn State, Miami, BYU, Oklahoma, Notre Dame. And Penn State and Miami won more than one. Then in the 1990s, you had Colorado, Georgia Tech, Washington, Miami, Alabama, FSU, Nebraska, Florida, Michigan, and Tennessee all claimed national championships in the 1990s. Okay. Then when you get to the early 2000s, 2000 through 2009, you have Oklahoma, Miami, Ohio State, LSU, USC, Texas, Florida, and Alabama. So now you got some repeats in there from a couple of the other decades, right? But you still have, what is that? That's 8 different teams. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, 8 different teams. But then when you get to the 2010s, you have Auburn, Alabama, FSU, Ohio State, Clemson, LSU. You only have 6 different teams that win titles. Now, again, part of that's Nick Saban, right? Nick Saban is in here. So you got like 3 Alabama championships in those 2010s. So that's a big part of that. But still, you're seeing that consolidation down. And another thing that's happening along the way is the conferences. In the 1980s, you had 4 different conferences and independents. Miami, actually, I said Miami was part of the Big East, but in the 1980 championships, the ones that they won, Miami won the national championship in 83, 87, 89 in 90. So they won 3. They were independent actually back then. And you could be an independent. I mean, talk about how conferences, Miami and Notre Dame, several schools were independents back then. And Miami was an independent, won the national championship. In the 1990s, those 10 different teams represented 6 different conferences. In the early 2000s, you had 5 different conferences among those 8 teams. By the time you get to the 2010s, now we're down to just 3 conferences among the 6 teams that shared the national championships of the 2010s. And of course, we're only halfway into the 2020s, so this isn't definitive yet. When you compare this list to the other part of that list, it doesn't quite compare. But you just have Alabama, Georgia, Michigan, Ohio State, and you're down to 2 conferences, right? So at this point, you're down to the 2 biggest teams in the 2 best teams of current. I'm not saying in all time in history, although actually Alabama and Georgia, as we've discussed, are essentially your 2 most successful teams of the SEC when you look at most program history. When you look at maybe not, I don't remember who claimed all the national champions, but let's just say when you look at all-time wins, ranked number 1, and you look at conference championships, Alabama and Georgia are the pinnacle of the SEC, and those are your 2 teams that have won national championships so far from the conference, the SEC, which is one of only 2 teams to share a national championship in 5 seasons so far in the 2020s. The other conference, the Big Ten, has had its 2 traditional heavyweights, Michigan and Ohio State. So you see that we've been sort of marching towards this inexorable move to history. So in one way, I think that where we've gone, the good side of NIL and portal is we're going back to a place where, and as much as I loved being one of those dominant blue blood teams that could assemble massive talent and out talent everybody when we stepped on the field, and most of those games, like we talked about, in a lot of that 3-year 29 in a row win streak, a lot of those games were foregone conclusions, even against top 25 and top 10 and top 15 teams, because we just out talented them so massively, right? So I love that. That was great. We loved it. It was great to be a Georgia Bulldog and to enjoy that. But I will admit, in the world of what's best for the sport, it's probably better that we're moving to an era that's much more open as far as you can, maybe Texas Tech, like I said, is a factor. And it's open in the sense you still have to spend. I mean, I don't think that the Boise States of the world, yes, Boise State or Memphis is going to get into the playoff with the way we've got the rules set up now to give them a spot. And again, I'm going to tell you, that's a charity spot. And they're not competitive when you actually play the other teams. They're not going to win. They're not going to advance. They're going to get into a slot where they have to win 3 or 4 games against Alabama, Michigan, Ohio State, Georgia. No, they're not going to do that. They might win one. Sure, they might get in any given year, just like Boise State beat Oklahoma in that famous Fiesta Bowl. Yes, you can get one shot, but one of those teams is not going to get in to the playoff and then win 3 or 4 games to against these heavyweight teams. It's just not going to happen. So while this era is opening the door to have more teams in the playoff, again, Tennessee last year. Well, Tennessee fans can be excited and say, look, we made the playoff. Well, you didn't ever make a 4-team playoff, okay? And I mean, they won a national championship in 1998. So, and they are a legit high-level historical team. They're one of the better great teams of all time, one of the better all-time teams of the SEC. Maybe third behind us. You got an argument between Auburn, LSU, and Clemson. I mean, not Clemson, not SEC. Auburn, LSU, and Tennessee, mixing up my oranges, among who is the best team, the third best team, maybe all time. And I'm just saying that recent events have pushed Georgia, like we've talked about historically, into clearly second in the history of the SEC, Alabama, Georgia. And then you got a group there of Florida, Auburn, Tennessee, LSU. And they all have different points you can argue as far as national championships, SEC championships, all-time rankings, stuff like that. But it's a pretty close argument. So, but that, what I was trying to say there is we have opened up this era where, now you have playoff. And so, sure, Tennessee is one of those great team, a potentially great team out of the SEC, or a legitimate team out of the SEC. But last year's Tennessee team was a 10-2 team that got beat badly by us, the SEC champion. And then they lost, I forget what the other game they lost in the season was, but they lost another game in the season. So then they get in the playoff and they get beat badly by Ohio State. So they were not competitive against the actual championship level teams. And in any other version of historical college football setup, all the eras we talked about, bowl and pole to now, they wouldn't have been a part of a discussion about the national championship. So grafting them into the playoff was charity. And it's the same level of charity that Boise State got from being in there too, or Indiana got. They're charity in the sense that there's no version in any other era of college football where these teams would have had a chance. And we can see now, I mean, we always saw then, the argument then was, well, the system before was closed, and you had to be one of those great teams that everybody knows about to move up in the rankings and be chosen as national champion. This is open. We're going to play it on the field. Okay, great. You're playing it on the field. What's happened on the field? Indiana wasn't competitive. SMU wasn't competitive. Tennessee, even an SEC team, upper third SEC team from last season, actually wasn't even competitive, really, in the scheme of things in the playoff, right? So it's great. We're letting all these people in. We have this access, but the reality is, yes, you can buy your way in, but do you think that the Boise States and the Memphises are going to be able to buy the same teams that the Ohio States and the Alabamas and the Georgias are going to, or Oregon are going to be able to buy? No, they're not. So I don't know that the open buying era is going to create more access. It is true that we've at least broken up the juggernauts. We're not going to have this massive assemblage of talent. So it's more wide open when we look right now at the teams that could win a national championship. So let's go back to, I had my list. I mentioned the other day of the teams, this week's list of who's on the watch list, who I think are, that we're watching to see if they're going to emerge as one of the 12 playoff teams. Ohio State, Georgia, Penn State, Miami, Oregon, LSU, Oklahoma, Florida State, Texas A&M, Texas, Iowa State, Tennessee, Alabama, Indiana, Ole Miss. Iowa State's on there because they've got a legit chance to win the Big 12. Okay. And right now you don't see Texas Tech listed there. So maybe I need to revise that and think about that. Joel Klatt got me thinking about that, but I'll go back and look at that. But Iowa State, Texas Tech, TCU, those are all teams right now that look like they're showing strong in the Big 12. And so they're all going to have something to say about that. But again, pick any of those teams. I don't know about Texas Tech for sure, but at the moment, I'm not a believer that what I just said is true of those teams either, that they're going to get into a 12-team playoff and win their way through it. Again, Arizona State got the bye last year as a Big 12 champion. They probably could have beaten, or maybe even should have, depending on how that game flowed, beat Texas. So they might have won one game. But do you think that they go on? I mean, what would have happened? So the next thing that happened was that Texas won that game. So Texas beats Clemson. Okay. Texas beats Arizona State. And then Texas gets into a quarterfinal matchup or semifinal, I guess quarterfinal matchup. No, semifinal. Yeah, that's right. I'm sorry. So they get in the semifinal matchup with Ohio State. And they lost a competitive game. I mean, Ohio State controlled it throughout, won 28-14. But, I mean, they didn't blow the doors off Texas. But Texas didn't do anything great either in that game. Ohio State was just too good and too powerful in that run, in that game. But what I'm saying is Arizona State would have had to turn around and beat Ohio State and then beat, Notre Dame. I mean, maybe they could have beat Notre Dame. But, I mean, it's as good as Arizona State played last year. They did a good job getting there, but it's probably wasn't reasonable based on talent levels to assume that they could get through 3 or 4 games into the. They only had to do 3 because they got the bye. But Texas, we knew Texas was a talented team, even though we beat them twice, won the SEC championship, and they didn't. They were able to beat Clemson, solid team. They were able to beat Arizona State, gamer team, good team out of the Big 12. And they were competitive against Ohio State. If they'd won that game, they would have had their shot at Notre Dame. I would have liked their chances against Notre Dame, but, hard to say. So I mean, as we look at these teams that I listed, how many do we really think can advance through a playoff? Like we were talking about, who's really going to get through the NCAA tournament and win? You might be the last team in, but are you actually going to advance? I mean, it'll be fun, but are you going to go anywhere? Ohio State, Georgia, Penn State, Miami, Oregon, maybe LSU, maybe Florida State, maybe Texas. I mean, right now, of all those 12 teams or 15 teams I listed, those are the ones that I think probably legitimately have the pieces and the talent to be national championship contenders. The good news is what's happened, and it's not really about the playoff. It's, again, about NIL and portal. What's happened is none of those teams are juggernauts. And that's what I keep saying. So what are we looking for? We're looking back. All of this is to say, look, we have to adjust our perspective. As Georgia fans, we're not looking anymore for the juggernaut that we built just in the last 10 years. What we're looking for is what we used to have when I was a kid in the 80s and the 90s and watched this wide open, crazy world where BYU could win a championship. And I think this structure, what I'm saying is this structure still keeps the BYUs out of it. BYU would not win a championship in this world today. Okay, because that BYU team would have made it to the playoff and then would have to, just like I just said, win their way through a gauntlet of other top teams to win. And if BYU had to play 3 games or 4 games against the elites of the college football world, I don't think that BYU team would have done it. They would have gotten eliminated. Would have been a great season. Everybody would have been like, wow, good for them. Clap, clap, clap. They were eliminated. So I think in actually winning the championship, we've done that. We've removed that. Now, among these elite teams, like I said, it's a little too early to look at the consolidation of the 2000s where you only have 2 conferences. But realistically, we're down to what we call a Power Four conference. So you got the Big 12, the ACC, the SEC, and the ACC, and so the Big 12. Oh, and the Big 10. I'm sorry, blanked out for a minute. The Big 10, Big 12 throws you off. It's hard to keep track of why they're, So anyway, so those are the four conferences, but so far it's just been the SEC and the Big 10. And most years, that's where it's going to come from. The heavyweight, whatever team emerges as the best one or two teams from those conferences, and they're likely, whether the Big 10 gets its way and we have four automatic bids or not, if we expand to a 16-team field, more often than not, you're going to have three or four teams from those two conferences in the playoff. And when you have three or four teams, that means, look, the SEC dominance, the reason we all, SEC means more and chant SEC is because the SEC is the only conference going all the way back through that history. The Big 10 now, when they put together what used to be the Pac-12 and the Big 10, you can look at a bunch of different teams. USC has won a national championship in the last 40 years. Washington has won a national championship in the last 40 years. Oregon is not yet, but they've been in the game. Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, all teams that have won national championships. So the current version of the Big Ten has 5 or 6 teams that, like the SEC, that have won national championships in the modern era of college football. But only the SEC can boast 4 or 5 teams that have won it recently: Auburn, LSU, Georgia, Alabama. And if you want to go all the way back to 1998, you can include Tennessee, I guess. So I mean, but you got at least 4 teams since the 2010s who have won at least one or more national championships. And Auburn's the only one in that group who's only won one. LSU, Georgia, Alabama all won multiple national championships in that time. So we're still bent towards the heavyweights. The conferences still have that consolidation of money. They still have the edge in getting teams into the playoff. And they're still going to have the edge in playing their way through the playoff and winning against these teams that have lesser talent. We still have more talent, but you're not going to have juggernauts anymore. And even in the conference, all of those teams have flaws. All of those teams are not just going to be able to match and have an answer for everything and anything you could do. Georgia 2021, Georgia 2022 had an answer for whatever you did on the field. Didn't mean we won every game. Obviously, the 2021 team lost to Alabama in the SEC championship game. That year, it didn't cost us. We got in the playoff, we got our chance, and we won. And we got retribution by beating Alabama. But then 2023, same scenario. We get to the SEC championship game, we lose. This time we're out of the playoffs. So that's not going to happen anymore. Now we're always going to be in. So that's our adjustment. We're looking at that older era, and we're saying, look, this what we need to do to build what is going to look like a championship team. I guess what I'm trying to get at is I'm not trying to just blow sunshine on us and make us feel good for no reason. That's my goal here, is not to be the ever optimist Georgia fan who just tells you why Georgia's the best team, regardless of what the facts say. But what I'm trying to tell you is we are a team. We have, by any objective standard that people use today, we're one of the 5 most talented teams in the sport. And we have some flaws. Our offensive line is really shaky right now. Our new wide receiver core looks excellent. We weren't sure about our quarterback, and it's really just been one game, but we believe in what he's doing. We thought our defense was going to be rising back to being an elite standard after taking a big step back last year. And in the first 2 games of the year, they seemed to do that, but they got torched against Tennessee. But a lot of people get torched against Tennessee. I mean, Tennessee has not historically done it against us in the previous 4 years, but they have done it against everybody, including a couple Alabama teams. A couple Nick Saban Alabama teams gave up 500 yards and 40-something, 50 points, whatever. So, I mean, it's not like they haven't done it. They just hadn't previously done it to us. But again, even doing that, putting out their best offensive effort ever against us and getting 40-something points on the board and almost 500 yards offense, they still didn't have enough tools, because we have enough tools in any phase of the game. We're not dominant in all phases of the game, but we can win every phase of the game. We can win on defense. We can win on offense. We can win at special teams. And we still have among the most talent in the sport. We can't run 3 deep out there or even 2 deep out there at every position. You see that right now in offensive line. We're struggling to find 5 guys that we believe can be a power line all throughout the game. We've seen that they can be a power force through parts of the game. They were parts of the Tennessee game, like that first drive to start the second half. Took the ball and just rammed it down Tennessee's throat. 13 running plays, one pass, and it was a screen pass. So basically a run play. So we just jammed it down their throat. But we just can't do it the whole game. We can't do it all the time because we don't have too deep across the offensive line of all guys who are going to be first through third round NFL guys anymore. I mean, that's just not where we are right now, and you cannot keep that level of talent. The idea of people being able to transfer to find a place to play sooner and just getting the money, just where somebody says, look, don't, I mean, there are slots for this, right? The way this is working out is if you're a second string or third string offensive lineman at a school, then you're going to get X. If you're first string, you're going to get Y, and Y is better than X in this case, right? So these guys just look at it and they say, well, I mean, it's not even just the chance to start. It's just like, hey, I can go over here and make twice as much money. Well, we all do that in life, right? I mean, you might like the company you work for, the situation you're in now, but if somebody offers you a chance to move somewhere and make twice as much money as you're making right now, pretty good chance you're going to consider that. So this era is wide open, but it also, this 12-team playoff is not wide open. This 12-team playoff ultimately yields to who can get through it. So what's the point of all this? We need to reevaluate how we look at Georgia. We need to reevaluate how we consider this game. This game is huge. I want to win this game more than I've wanted to win a lot of games in a long time. I wanted to win the Tennessee game because I wanted that 9-game win streak. But in reality, I don't know how much it would have hurt me to lose. It wasn't the biggest deal ever. This is the last hurdle, as you've heard me say, in righting wrongs of historical past or recent past. This is the last team that has an edge on us, not just currently, but all throughout history. This is the team that's been better than us all throughout the history of the SEC. This is the team that's been better than us in even the recent years. The one place that we have them is we have won 2 national championships and back-to-back more recently than they have. Okay. And we won one of them by beating them. So there's an acknowledgement there that, look, and everybody can say, look, Georgia the last 10 years has been the equal of Alabama, but Alabama has gotten the better of Georgia most of those times. I don't think the 2023 Alabama team was better than Georgia, but they beat us in the SEC championship game, took our playoff spot. I don't think last year's team was better. They objectively weren't. We were in the playoff and finished, in the AP poll in the top ranked. They did not. They missed the playoff. They lost 4 games, but they beat us. Okay. So we got to win this game and we got to change that. But what we're looking for as Georgia fans out of this game and what we're looking for in this season is we're looking like almost back to the 80s and 90s where you're looking for a team that it's kind of, can you qualify to get to the space? In other words, can you put a team out on the field that has a chance to win its conference, compete and be in the top 10 so you get a shot at the playoff? That's where we are right now. And that makes it look a lot more like the old bowl and poll era is really what I was thinking about, that 80s and 90s, when any team from any conference could go undefeated, get a lot of press, and get a shot at being voted national champion. The difference is when you were BYU and nobody else made it undefeated and you got enough press, then all of a sudden you could play in the Holiday Bowl, go undefeated, and be declared national champion. But in this era, that BYU team is going to have to do what the Indiana team last year did, what even Tennessee had to do, what everybody has to do, which is get into this playoff. And when you get in this playoff, you're going to run into some real teams, okay? And all of a sudden, the regular season, and this is where the regular season has been devalued. It's not what it used to be because last year's champion, we tend to forget, last year's champion finished the regular season completely disappointed. Fan base almost, again, Kirk Herbstreit wondered if they would even have been better off playing the game somewhere else than to have to face Tennessee coming there and the situation. And so what do? They jump out and they take that motivation, or they did whatever it is they do, because they were still an incredibly talented team, and they steamroll through the playoffs and they win a national championship. But don't lose sight of the fact that team, that Ohio State team, finished 6th in the AP poll and 6th in the playoff poll, okay? In the 4-team playoff, and this is just what I said about Tennessee before. Same thing applies to this Ohio State team, last year's national champion. There is no version in the history of college football that Ohio State team would have ever made a sniff at being national champion. Okay. They had 2 losses. They were 6th in any poll. They would not have made a 4-team playoff. They would not have made the bowl and poll era. Even if they got into the Rose Bowl and won it, they're not going to jump from 6. Nobody ever jumped from 6 to number 1 in the chaos that was the bowl season. Maybe 4 or 5, but never 6. Nobody ever won with 2 losses. Okay. And they would not have made the BCS era. So they would not have been a bowl and poll era champion or even been close. They would not have been a BCS era champion or even close. They would not have been the number 1 team at the end of the BCS and the +1. You didn't jump from there with 2 losses, having been 6th. Somebody else would have gotten that slot. They would not have made the 4-team playoff. And yet what they had was they had the assemblage of talent. They had a quarterback that reminds me a lot of Gunnar Stockton. Will Howard was a guy that, again, nobody thought of as this is the guy who takes you to the championship. And he spent the first 3 years or whatever his career at Kansas State. And he came over and nobody ever said, oh, what you need is the Kansas State quarterback. That's what propels you to a national championship. So, but he was good enough. They had amazing wide receivers. They had an incredible defense. They kept a lot of people. Again, they were a veteran team that spent a lot of NIL money and they kept their running back. They kept their veteran defense. They kept some linemen. They kept a wide receiver who could have gone pro. They kept a bunch of pieces, spending a lot of money. So they were like those old teams of the 80s that they brought all together this experience and talent, and it peaked. And they completely fell flat in the regular season, and they blew their chance in any other era of college football history, except for this one. In this one, when the playoffs started, just like they say in all the other pro sports, it's a new season. Everything starts new here in the playoff. Well, it was a new season. They turned around immense disappointment of falling flat and losing to Michigan for the 4th time in a row. And they hammered Tennessee. And then they, steamrolled their way through the playoff. Then they beat Texas and Notre Dame ultimately, and I forget who else. Anyway, so, they had to beat Texas, Notre Dame. Yeah, they had to play 4 games. They beat Tennessee, Texas. Anyway, you get the point. They steamrolled their way through the playoff with an impressive run of wins. So, yeah, they beat Tennessee 42-17. Then they get a crack. Oh, at Oregon. I left out Oregon. They play the number 1, the only team that was actually undefeated last year that did the old version. They went undefeated, won their conference championship. They were the number 1 seed. This almost charity case, as we've been discussing at Ohio State team, gets in the playoff. Well, in the rematch against Ohio State, they lost earlier in the rematch against Oregon, Ohio State wins this one and they blow them out 41-21. Okay. So, which is astounding, right? And then they take down Texas 28-14. And then ultimately they're able to beat Notre Dame 34-23, and Notre Dame got some gift points at the end when Ohio State was playing it safe, I think. But so in a way, they were also a charity case. They were a team in no era of the history of college football. So this has been a long retrospective on the history of college football, the bowl and poll era to now, and how it's changed. Because I keep saying there's no juggernauts, and we just have to, and so it's relational. We have to look at what we are. And so as fans, what we're looking for, I keep trying to say this, but I wanted that big picture perspective to put some answers behind that. We're looking and we're watching this season to see, look, we're going to make the playoff most likely. I mean, I don't want to just sign up and say, I don't want to be the guy who ruins this. This is a wood desk, so I'm going to knock on it. But we have the talent, we have the schedule. If we go 10-2, we're in the playoff. If we're in the playoff, then as Ohio State showed, regardless of how you finish the season, regardless of whether you would have been a champion in any other era, you can get on a streak and win. But you're not going to get on a streak and win if you're SMU or Indiana or even last year's Tennessee team. You can't be that flawed. So you have to be good enough to have all the tools it takes to be able in any given game to win on offense, win on defense, win on special teams, have the coaching, have the experience, have the guys who've been there before, have the new guys with the talent, and execute at the right time. And it's going to take a little bit of luck. It's going to be that sort of mix like the 80s where it's a little bit of luck and a little bit of new and a little bit of old, and it's all going to have to come together at the right time. It came together at the right time. I don't know why it didn't come together for Ohio State during the regular season, but it came together like lightning in the postseason. And they had the talent. They had that capability within them to be that team. So that's what we're looking for. That's what we're looking for in this game. This is a measuring stick. This is one of the big measuring sticks. We got past the Tennessee one. And we didn't look great on defense, but our offense was surprisingly good. Our special teams was rock solid. Our defense and our coaching and our game plan, our intangibles were there. And we played with grit, toughness, and tenacity. We played with fire, passion, and energy that Kirby Smart's been asking for. So that made us look that made us look like a team that could be one of those teams that, when in the playoff, could advance. We're going to see more this week when we play Alabama. Alabama may not end up being a playoff team. They may have a very disappointing season. They may rally and become a playoff team and be a serious contender too. We're going to find out about them too. This game probably won't propel anybody in or keep anybody out. The winner or loser of this game, both are probably still. Alabama's got a little more on the line because they've already got the one loss, and it was not a pretty loss against FSU. So if they lose, but it's a close loss, but then they go on and win the rest of their schedule, maybe it looks okay. I mean, Tennessee actually is getting mileage out of a close loss because people are like, you know what, Georgia is still Georgia, and Tennessee hung in there. And so they actually, again, they were 15th coming into that game. They're still 15th. They didn't lose any ground in the polls or perception from losing a close game to us. If Alabama's able to do the same thing on the road, maybe they get the same perception. If they lose badly, then maybe their perception is too far out of the running, regardless of what they do, to get back into that playoff. On the other hand, 10-2 out of the SEC would be hard to beat. So, I mean, long story short, again, probably neither team is going to cement themselves in the playoff or eliminate themselves from the playoff. But Alabama has a little bit more on edge because they already have that loss. They have a little less margin for error here. So we're going to get back into it. We're going to start breaking down offense versus defense versus offense, special teams. We're going to look at what we know about those individual units and where we think that Georgia can win, where we think Georgia's in trouble. We obviously are all concerned about the offensive line, and that is a deep concern. So we're going to dig into that more the next day or two. But I just want to spend the time to do something we hadn't really done this year, which is that retrospective of football that adds a little more context to what I've been saying about judging us against the other teams out there. And right now, as a Georgia Bulldog fan, I think you got to feel pretty good about where we are in this new era, which is radically different than what it was 3 years ago, 4 years ago. In this new era, we're right where we need to be in the same kind of position like what Ohio State did last year. Even if we end up losing this game, even if we suffer some disappointments, this is a different era. So it's not a wide open era that invites teams from anywhere in any conference in anymore. We may see nothing but the best one or two teams from the SEC or Big Ten win national championships, and that be it. We may be limited on that side going forward. But as far as who from those conferences can get in, I mean, it's kind of wide open in that regard, and what it takes, and it's look, right now we have a lot of teams just in our conference that are still clearly in that discussion. LSU still hasn't lost, maybe not any good on offense, but they've got the pieces to be good on offense. We thought they were going to be good on offense. We weren't sure about their defense coming in the season. Defense is dominant. Like I said in a previous podcast or two, really at this point in the SEC, for SEC title conference, which is going to lead to playoff, if you're in that contention, the only teams that have eliminated themselves are probably Kentucky, Florida, and there was one other I was thinking, but I don't know. I mean, Texas A&M still in the running. Texas is still in the running. LSU, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia. I'm leaving others out. I don't know if Mississippi State's 4-0. I don't know if we can really say they're in the running yet, but look, they're 4-0, so we can't ignore them. Ole Miss is still in the running. That's one I left out. So Vandy is still in the running. I don't know if we really think they're going to win. I mean, you look at the rest of their schedule, as well as they played and good as they look, their schedule is brutal down the stretch. So South Carolina, I guess, is probably out of the running, you would think, right now. They've absorbed 2 SEC losses, so they're behind. I mean, they could still finish with a nice season, a decent bowl game, but it's hard. Maybe even a sniff at a playoff at large bit. But at least for the SEC, they look with 2 losses. They're certainly too far back to consider them in the running. So it's still wide open, and all those teams have some good things about them and flaws. Some are more talented than others, but it's exciting. There's a lot to look at. So again, we'll get back into Alabama a little deeper. I can tell you, right off the bat, I'm just feeling like it's going to be hard to get anything out of looking at those matchups. We'll break down what I think about our offense, but I mean, I think Alabama's defense has thus far performed a little more consistently than ours. Again, limited sample size. And they didn't play Tennessee. Who knows what would have happened if they played Tennessee? They haven't played anybody like a Tennessee. So, but FSU's offense looks like something we could do to Alabama's defense. And our defense, I think, has a chance to play better. Even though I think Alabama's wide receivers are better, I think the matchup, and we'll talk about this tomorrow, I think the matchup of our defense and Alabama's offense is probably a better matchup for us. Even though Alabama's offense you probably have a more talented quarterback and more talented wide receivers. So, and it's possible Alabama's offensive line coming into the season is probably better thought of than Tennessee's line, which really kept us from being overly, we didn't get a lot of pass rush. Everybody saw that. And you've heard David Pollock said he just didn't see guys who looked like they could win, meaning, win one-on-one battles, defensive line against offensive line. He didn't see that, us getting a lot of pressure. So we'll have to see where that goes. So listen, I appreciate you going through this with me. This is the big picture. It's not just, it's Georgia all day, every day, right? But Georgia is in the context of all the college football around us, right? We have to, and so looking at that, looking at what's going around us, looking at the history of it, to really understand where we're going, that's where you have to be. So I think we're excited about it. I think we should be excited about it. I think I see the pieces forming that puts us in a position in this new era, and this era is maybe 2 or 3 years old, this new era of where we could win in college football. We can win at the highest level. So it's going to be exciting to see what happens in this game this week. So look, we'll call it for there. We'll call it for today. Very, very long podcast, longest one ever. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you appreciated the retrospective and history. Please give me any comments and let me know. Feel free to share the podcast with others, and tell other people to come and join us. Let's get more people talking. Join the chat on Substack. Send me an email. Send me any kind of comment from any of the social medias. I'll try to incorporate those comments and respond to anything I can here in the podcast. We'll dig into breaking down those matchups and the outcome possibilities in tomorrow and the next day's podcast. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope you have a great day, a great Thursday, and go Dogs.